collapse happened at 3:47 a.m. on a Tuesday morning in Henderson County, Nevada. What started as a routine search and rescue training exercise at an abandoned industrial complex turned into the most controversial incident in the county's law enforcement history. And at the center of it all was a 4-year-old Belgian Malinois named Skipper and his handler, Officer Pedro Vasquez. Pedro had been with the K-9 unit for 6 years, but his relationship with the department had been strained ever since he'd testified against his former partner in a corruption investigation. The brass had reassigned him to overnight shifts and given him Skipper, a dog that 3 previous handlers had returned, claiming he was too aggressive and unpredictable. It was supposed to be a punishment, a way to quietly push Pedro toward resignation. Instead, Pedro and Skipper became the most effective team the unit had ever seen. That night, they were supposed to be practicing disaster response protocols in the Old Meridian Steel Factory, a sprawling complex scheduled for demolition the following week. The building had been condemned for 2 years, deemed structurally unsound after decades of neglect. No one was supposed to be inside. The exercise was just training, until Skipper started barking. What no one knew was that the factory had become a hiding place for something far more dangerous than rusted equipment and crumbling concrete. For months, a trafficking ring had been using the abandoned facility as a way station, moving people through the desert under cover of darkness. The organizer was someone with deep connections to local government, someone who had been tipped off about the demolition schedule and was planning one final transport before the building came down. But the timeline had changed. The demolition company moved their schedule up by 3 days without public notice. And on that Tuesday morning, 12 people were locked in a reinforced storage room in the factory's basement, waiting for a transport that would never come. The building was set to implode at dawn. When Pedro and Skipper arrived for training, Skipper immediately detected something wrong. The dog refused to follow the training protocol, instead pulling Pedro toward the restricted section of the factory. Pedro faced an impossible choice: follow orders and complete the exercise, or trust a dog that everyone else had written off as unreliable and investigate an area that was explicitly off-limits. The decision Pedro made in that moment set off a chain reaction that would expose corruption reaching into the sheriff's office itself, reveal a network of officials who had been paid to look the other way, and force everyone involved to confront uncomfortable truths about who was really being protected and served. The demolition was scheduled to begin in 4 hours. Skipper refused to leave, and what they found in that basement would shake the entire county to its core, not just because of who was trapped inside, but because of who had put them there. The skipper's claws scraped against concrete as he pulled so hard the leash burned through Pedro's glove. The Belgian Malinois wasn't just alert. He was frantic, his whole body rigid with purpose as he dragged Pedro toward a rusted door marked with faded warning signs. Pedro planted his feet, trying to regain control. The dog wheezed against his collar, refusing to stop.
"Skipper, hail," Pedro commanded.
His voice echoed through the empty factory floor. Nothing. The dog didn't even glance back. Instead, Skipper lunged forward again, this time with such force that Pedro stumbled and nearly lost his grip entirely. The radio on Pedro's belt crackled. "Vasquez, report your position." Sergeant Clemens sounded irritated. They were supposed to be running a simple grid search on the main floor. Pedro looked at the restricted door, then at Skipper, whose eyes were locked on something beyond the barrier. The dog's breathing came in quick, desperate bursts. "Skipper's alerting to something," Pedro said into the radio, "requesting permission to investigate the east basement access." Silence. Then Clemens's voice came back, clipped and cold. "Negative. That section is off-limits. Return to the designated training area immediately." Pedro's jaw tightened. Skipper whined, a high, urgent sound that made every hair on Pedro's neck stand up. In 6 years of working with dogs, he'd never heard one make that exact noise. It wasn't a game alert. It wasn't confusion. It was desperation. First welcoming CTA. He made his decision in less than a second. Pedro unclipped Skipper's leash. The dog shot forward like a bullet, scratching at the basement door with both paws. Pedro followed, his boots crunching over broken glass and debris. The door was locked, but the frame had rusted through years ago. One solid kick and it swung inward with a groan of metal. Darkness swallowed them whole. Pedro clicked on his flashlight. The beam cut through thick air that smelled wrong. Too still, too warm, like something had been trapped down here breathing the same oxygen over and over. Skipper didn't wait. He bounded down the concrete stairs, his nails clicking rapidly against each step. "Skipper, wait," Pedro hissed. But the dog was already gone, disappeared into the basement's shadows. Pedro descended carefully, testing each step before putting his full weight on it. The stairs creaked ominously. Somewhere in the distance, he heard Skipper barking. Sharp, insistent, the pattern dogs used when they'd found something critical. The basement opened into a maze of corridors and storage rooms. Pedro swept his flashlight left and right, catching glimpses of old machinery, stacked pallets, puddles of stagnant water. His radio squawked again. "Vasquez, you're in direct violation of orders. Exit the restricted area now or face suspension." Pedro reached for the radio, his thumb hovering over the button. Then he heard something that made his blood freeze. A voice. Human. Faint but unmistakable. Someone crying. He broke into a run. The corridor twisted and turned, forcing Pedro to duck under low-hanging pipes and squeeze past collapsed shelving. Skipper's barking grew louder, more frantic. Pedro rounded a corner and found the dog standing in front of a heavy steel door, pawing at the base, his body trembling with urgency. "Good boy," Pedro whispered, approaching slowly. He pressed his ear against the metal. First nothing, then voices, multiple people, panicked, calling out for help. Pedro's heart slammed against his ribs. There were people trapped in there. He grabbed the door handle and pulled. Locked. The mechanism was industrial grade, requiring a key or code he didn't have. He pulled harder, throwing his shoulder into it. Nothing budged. Inside, someone screamed. The sound was raw, terrified, bouncing off walls that had to be thick as prison cells. "Hello," Pedro shouted. "Can you hear me?" Immediate response. Dozens of voices overlapping, shouting, begging. Pedro couldn't make out individual words, but the desperation was universal. These people thought they were going to die. Skipper barked again, then did something strange. He ran back down the corridor about 20 feet and started digging at the wall. Pedro followed, confused, until he realized what the dog had found. A ventilation grate, old, rusted, but large enough for a person to crawl through, or for sound to travel. Pedro yanked the grate free. The metal came away in chunks of corroded flakes. Behind it was a narrow shaft barely 2 feet wide. Skipper immediately squeezed inside, his body disappearing into the darkness. Pedro grabbed his flashlight and followed, scraping his shoulders against the metal walls. The shaft angled downward, twisting in directions that defied logic. Pedro's flashlight beam bounced ahead, catching glimpses of Skipper's tail. The air grew thicker, harder to breathe. He could hear the voices clearly now. Crying, praying, someone counting in Spanish. Children's voices mixed with adults. His stomach turned. The shaft ended abruptly, opening into a small mechanical room. Pedro dropped down, landing hard on concrete. Skipper was already at another door, scratching frantically. This one wasn't locked. Pedro pushed it open and the smell hit him like a physical force. Sweat, fear, human waste, desperation concentrated in recycled air. His flashlight revealed faces. Too many faces. People huddled in a storage room no bigger than a 2-car garage. Men, women, children. Some were slumped against the walls, barely conscious. Others rushed toward him, hands reaching, voices overlapping in English and Spanish. "Please help us." A woman clutched his arm. Her face was gaunt, lips cracked. "They locked us in. 3 days. No food. No water. Pedro's mind raced. 3 days meant this wasn't an accident. Someone had deliberately imprisoned these people. A young girl, maybe 7 years old, sat in the corner clutching a stuffed rabbit. She wasn't crying. She was past that. Her eyes glazed with the empty stare of someone who'd given up hope. Pedro felt something crack inside his chest. "I'm getting you out," he said. His voice didn't sound like his own. "All of you, right now." He reached for his radio, but before he could speak, the building shuddered. A deep, mechanical groan echoed through the walls. Dust rained from the ceiling. An older man grabbed Pedro's shoulder. "What was that?" His accent was thick, his eyes wide with terror. Pedro knew exactly what it was. He'd heard that sound during demolition prep training. They were testing the charges. "They're going to bring the building down," Pedro said. His mouth went dry. "When?" the man asked. Pedro checked his watch. The demolition was scheduled for 6 a.m. It was 4:15 now. Less than 2 hours. But that sound meant they were running preliminary tests, which meant the actual demolition could happen anytime. Skipper barked sharply, then bolted back toward the mechanical room. Pedro understood. The dog was telling him they needed to move. "Now, everyone who can walk, stand up," Pedro commanded. "We're leaving through the ventilation shaft." A woman shook her head frantically. "We can't fit. It's too small." Pedro looked at the shaft opening. She was right. The adults might make it, but barely. The children would be terrified crawling through that darkness. Another tremor shook the building. Somewhere above them, metal screeched against concrete. A man started praying loudly in Spanish. The young girl with the stuffed rabbit began to cry. Pedro's training screamed at him to call for backup, to follow protocol, to let the professionals handle this. But protocol was what got these people locked in a basement in the first place. Protocol was written by the same people who'd been paid to look the other way. If he called this in through official channels, someone might delay the response just long enough for the building to come down with everyone inside. No witnesses. No evidence. Just another industrial accident in a county full of corruption. Skipper barked again, more insistently. The dog was right. They were out of time. Pedro grabbed the young girl and lifted her. "What's your name?" he asked softly. "Lucia," she whispered. "Okay, Lucia. I need you to be very brave. Can you do that for me?" She nodded, squeezing the stuffed rabbit tighter. He carried her to the shaft and set her down gently at the entrance. Skipper immediately moved beside her, pressing his body against hers. The dog knew what Pedro was asking. "Skipper's going to lead you," Pedro told Lucia. "You follow him, okay? He won't let anything happen to you." Lucia's small hand reached out and grabbed Skipper's collar. The dog looked back at Pedro, his eyes intelligent and aware. This wasn't training. This was real. Pedro nodded once. Skipper turned and started into the shaft, moving slowly so Lucia could keep pace. One by one, Pedro sent the children through with Skipper leading them. Then the smaller adults. Then everyone else squeezing and scraping through that impossible narrow passage. The building groaned again. Louder this time. Longer. Something was failing. Pedro was the last one in the storage room. He did a final sweep with his flashlight, making sure no one had been left behind. That's when he saw it. Tucked in the corner, partially hidden by debris, a laptop, still on. Battery indicator showing 30%. He grabbed it and shoved it into his vest. Evidence. Whatever was on that computer could prove who was responsible for this. He squeezed into the shaft just as another tremor hit, this one violent enough to knock him sideways. Metal groaned. The shaft was compressing. Pedro crawled faster, his shoulders scraping against walls that seemed to be closing in. Ahead, he could hear voices. People had made it out of the shaft and were in the corridor. Skipper barked, the sound echoing back through the metal tunnel. The dog was calling him forward. The shaft made one final turn and Pedro saw light. Real light. He burst out of the opening, tumbling onto concrete, gasping for air. Hands pulled him to his feet. The group surrounded him. 12 people who'd been left to die, now standing in the basement corridor, alive. "This way," Pedro said, leading them toward the stairs. They moved as quickly as the weakest among them could manage. Behind them, the building continued its death groans. They were halfway up the stairs when Pedro heard footsteps above them. Heavy boots. Multiple people. The group froze. A flashlight beam cut through the darkness from the top of the stairs. Then a voice Pedro recognized. "Sergeant Clemens. Vasquez, stand down. You're under arrest for insubordination and trespassing in a restricted area." Pedro stared up at the silhouette blocking their exit. 3 more figures appeared beside Clemens. All in uniform, all standing between Pedro's group and freedom. Skipper growled, a low rumble that promised violence if needed. "These people were locked in the basement," Pedro called out. "They've been here for 3 days. No food, no water. Someone tried to kill them." Silence from above. Then Clemens descended 3 steps. "You don't understand what you've stumbled into, Vasquez. This is bigger than you. Walk away now and we'll forget this happened." Pedro felt the laptop pressing against his chest under his vest. "I'm not walking away from 12 innocent people." Another tremor. This one sent chunks of concrete falling from the ceiling. A woman screamed. The little girl, Lucia, clutched Pedro's leg. Clemens took another step down. "The building's coming down in 20 minutes. Those people signed up for what they got. But you're a cop. You've got a career, pension. Don't throw it away for people who don't matter." Something white-hot exploded in Pedro's chest. "Everyone matters." Skipper barked once, sharp and commanding. The dog moved between Pedro and Clemens, his body coiled and ready. The sergeant's hand moved toward his weapon. "Call your dog off, Vasquez." Pedro's mind calculated odds. 4 armed officers at the top of the stairs. 12 vulnerable people behind him. 1 exhausted cop and a dog who refused to give up. The math didn't work. Unless he changed the equation. "The demolition company," Pedro said loudly, his voice carrying through the stairwell. "They moved up the schedule by 3 days. That's not standard procedure. Someone paid them to do it. Someone who knew these people were down here and wanted them buried." Clemens froze. "You're talking crazy." "Am I?" Pedro pulled out his phone. No signal down here, but the recording app still worked. He'd started it the moment he entered the basement. "Because I've got 12 witnesses and a recording of everything you just said, including the part where you called human beings disposable." The sergeant's face went pale in the flashlight beam. "Give me the phone, Vasquez."
No.
Another tremor. This one made the stairs themselves crack. A deep splitting sound echoed from somewhere in the building's core. They were running out of time. One of the officers behind Clemens spoke up. "Sarge, the building's actually coming down. We need to evacuate. All of us." Clemens didn't move. His jaw worked like he was chewing through options he didn't have. Pedro took a step forward. "You can arrest me after we get these people out. But right now, you let us pass or everyone dies here. Including you." For 5 terrible seconds, nobody moved. Then Skipper did something extraordinary. The dog walked up the stairs, right past Clemens and sat at the top, looking back, waiting, like he knew the humans would follow once one of them had the courage to move first. The young officer who'd spoken before stepped aside. "I'm not dying for this," he said quietly. Another officer followed. Then the third. Clemens stood alone, blocking the path, until finally his shoulders sagged and he moved. Pedro led the group past the officers and up into the main factory floor. The early morning light filtered through broken windows. It was the most beautiful thing Pedro had ever seen. He counted heads. 12 people, all alive. Skipper trotted beside Lucia, who still held his collar. They were 30 feet from the exit when the building gave its final warning. A sound like thunder rolled through the structure. The floor beneath them tilted slightly. Someone screamed, "Run!" Pedro shouted. They ran. All of them, moving as fast as legs weakened by days of captivity could manage. Pedro scooped up Lucia, carrying her as he sprinted toward the door. Skipper stayed beside him, matching his pace. Behind them, the demolition charges detonated. Not the controlled sequence they were supposed to follow, but a catastrophic chain reaction triggered by structural failure. The sound was deafening. The air pressure changed. Pedro felt the blast wave hit his back like a physical shove. He dove through the exit with Lucia clutched to his chest. They hit gravel, rolling. Others tumbled out beside them. Skipper cleared the door just as the building's facade collapsed inward. A cloud of dust and debris exploded outward, washing over them like a wave. For several long seconds, Pedro couldn't see anything. Couldn't hear anything except ringing in his ears. Then the dust began to settle. He looked around frantically, counting. 11 people on the ground around him. Where was the 12th? The cry came from near the entrance. A young man had fallen, his leg trapped under a piece of fallen concrete. He was 5 feet from the door, and the building was still collapsing section by section, coming toward them. Pedro handed Lucia to another woman and ran back. He grabbed the concrete, trying to lift. Too heavy. He pulled harder. Nothing. The man screamed in pain and terror. Another section of the building fell, sending more debris toward them. Then Skipper was there. The dog grabbed the man's shirt in his teeth and pulled backward with all his strength. The action shifted the man's position just enough. Pedro lifted again, felt the concrete give slightly. The man yanked his leg free. They ran as the final section came down. The impact threw them forward. Pedro hit the ground hard, vision swimming. When he looked up, the factory was gone. Just a massive pile of rubble and dust where a building had stood minutes before. Sirens filled the air. Fire trucks, ambulances, police cars. A fleet of emergency vehicles poured into the industrial lot. Someone must have reported the collapse. Or maybe Clemens had finally called it in. Pedro didn't care. He crawled to where the 12 people lay scattered on the gravel, checking each one. Bruised, bloodied, traumatized, but alive. Every single one alive. Lucia sat up, still clutching her stuffed rabbit. Tears cut clean lines through the dust on her face. "The doggy saved us," she whispered. Pedro looked for Skipper and felt his heart stop. The Belgian Malinois was lying motionless 20 feet away.
No.
Pedro stumbled to his feet and ran. He dropped to his knees beside Skipper, his hands shaking as he checked for breathing. The dog's eyes were closed. His body was still. "Come on, buddy. You don't get to do this. You don't get to save everyone else and not make it." He pressed his ear to Skipper's chest and that morning at the factory, Pedro had faced an impossible choice. Follow orders or trust a dog everyone else had given up on. He'd made the right call. Because sometimes the ones who refuse to leave, who refuse to give up, who refuse to accept that anyone is disposable, those are the ones who change everything. Skipper barked from the vehicle. Pedro knew what it meant. Time to go to work. There were always more people who needed help. And Skipper would never stop looking for them.